Today we're going to talk about the law and the various uses of the law that we find when it comes to the Bible. But the typical way that we think of the law as Christians is that we have come to think of it as legalism. We get this idea from Martin Luther, where he says basically the law has two functions. First, it has the ability to restrain evil in the world, to keep people from doing bad things, but also to show people that they do bad things. But for the most part, that's all the law can do, is it can just say, that's bad, don't do it. But it can't actually help us. And so when you try to start to use the law to help you, you're performing some sort of legalism if you're trying to earn your salvation. There's another view that gets nuanced, though, that says, well, maybe there's more to the law than just that it stops people from doing bad. What if the law also could actually help people to do good things? This idea comes from John Calvin, who calls this a third use of the law, or the moral law. Not only does Calvin think that the law can keep people from doing bad things to restrain evil, but also to show sin, but also, in addition to that, that the law actually does point out what things are good and can shape us into doing good things. You just think about a parent with a child, where certainly there's things where a parent will say, don't touch the stove, don't lie, don't steal, but at the same time, we're not simply trying to teach our kids the things not to do. We're hoping that we're actually going to shape them into good kids. Calvin sees that God is a good God and Father whose law is used to shape us as kids, not just to stop us from touching the stove or doing bad things, but actually to teach us to cook and to do other good things. Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic theologian, fleshes it out in a different manner. He says that the law can be seen as ceremonial. Those are the laws like the food laws, the laws on circumcision, the laws that bind what kind of clothing you wear, purity laws. These are ceremony laws in the Bible. They're not binding to us anymore. At the same time, the law can also be seen as civil law. These are laws that God used to help the Jewish people run the Jewish state. Again, those aren't binding today. Those may be good advice for us today, but we certainly don't have to reproduce the Davidic monarchy. The third category is the moral law. This is a timeless universal law. And when we read our Bibles, we need to be looking for the moral universal laws. Many people find Aquinas' three categories to be very helpful with reading their Old Testaments. There's a third way to approach the law. This perspective comes from a group called the New Perspective. The New Perspective says that the law is not really about stopping us from doing bad things. It's not there as a means to earn salvation. Instead, what the law is it is a covenant of grace. The only thing missing from the law is Jesus Christ, that God is the same yesterday as he is today, and he will be in the future. The idea is that God covenanted with Israel at Mount Sinai when he brought them out from Egypt and saved them, not because of anything that they did, but because of who he was and his promises. He gave the law to the Israelites as a means to live with him. He's a holy God, and so he needs to have a holy people. This is the means which people can live in grace. The New Perspective says that we should look to the law not as a means to earn salvation, but a means to understand how people live saved lives. Really, the best way to think about this is pretty well everything you know about Christianity is what Judaism understood, except Christ is missing. Basically, Judaism serves as a signpost to God's grace, the signpost to Christ, and the problem is that when Christ comes, people still hang out at the signpost. It's like they've got signs to Disneyland saying, go this way, let's have a fun time, and they never get up and go to Disneyland. They're still at the rest stop. The law is obedient response to the grace of God. Just like the Christian day, we live moral lives, we follow God's will as a response, as a means of showing that we are saved people. The law can be seen as a fence. So if you want to know what is proper to stay in God's will, how do we stay in God's will? The law is a fence to help us stay in God's will. It's defined very clearly so that you don't step out of that fence, but it's meant to be a fence of safety. Think of it as a fence like in your backyard. That sort of fence is there to help us. It's not meant to be a barrier fence. It's meant to be something that helps bring comfort and support. There's also this idea that outward actions can lead to inward change. So for Christians nowadays, practicing the spiritual disciplines like fasting or praying regularly, these sorts of things that we do on a constant basis, we hope that these things are changing our inward disposition. When we read our Bible on a regular basis, that spiritual discipline is meant to bring an inward change. It can become legalism if we were to just do that as a means to an end, but instead, if we think of the law as a way to change people on the inside. So Philo of Alexandria says, look, the whole reason that I follow food laws isn't because I'm particular on what I eat or what I don't eat, but instead what it does is it helps me to master my spiritual appetites because I can master my physical appetites. Fourth Maccabee says something very similar, that when we master our physical appetites, like eating and choices and following God's will in those little areas, that it helps us to master our spiritual life. So this is a different way to think about the law as a means of grace, as a covenant of grace. It's very likely that Matthew has this notion of the law in mind when he prescribes to his community the need to obey the law. Matthew is going to have Jesus say, not one jot, not one tittle of the law is to be removed, that we are to obey it fully, that Jesus came to fulfill the law and to have his followers follow the law. How do we understand the law? If it's a means of works righteousness, of legalism, it's hard to understand how that fits with Matthew's understanding. Instead, if we see it as a means of grace, and Jesus as the proper interpreter of the law, then we can see the law, Jesus' law, as an obedient response to the grace of God. That Matthew is giving us a new fence to define the community, the people of God. Matthew is having Jesus help us to see how our outward actions can lead to inward changes in our own lives. Matthew is trying to help Jesus be the new Moses who gives a new law and a new interpretation with the key hermeneutical principle of love God and love your neighbor. The law is just a means of acting that out, of graciously living out loving God and loving relationship in one's lives. There's outward signs of the law. These are circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath observance. And that in a covenant of grace, you have to have ways to identify yourself, boundary markers that say, I'm part of the inside group and not the outside group. For the Christian, our identity markers are no longer external things. They are, according to Paul, the Holy Spirit has become our identity marker. The word holy means to be set apart. Sometimes as Christians we make the mistake of having our outward actions be our identity markers, saying this is what makes us into a Christian. But it's not true. What you do on the outside does not make you a Christian or not make you a Christian. What defines you as a Christian is the blood of Christ, the presence of Christ through the power of the Spirit in our lives. That is the Christian sign, the marker of God's grace.